All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 31, Section 2, Political and Cultural Fusions. So last chapter, 31.1, we talked about the election of Ronald Reagan and really how his election in 1980 signaled what we would call a conservative revival. And that kind of stands in contrast to the 1960s, where a lot of change was going on, civil rights movement, Vietnam War, the emergence of a counterculture, identity politics, a lot of change, a lot of chaos in the 1960s, a lot of social unrest, riots, etc., etc. The 1980s, in some ways, is a backlash against that. And one of the constituencies that made Ronald Reagan or his election possible was kind of this evangelical Christian voting constituency. So, those who place high importance on their Christian faith, and largely over issues related to culture. And we refer to these things as the culture wars, and these really kind of start in the 1980s. This was, where do you stand on issues regarding things like homosexuality? Where do you stand on maybe something like flag burning or other controversial free speech issues? Where do you stand on the women's movement or feminism? And it was mostly these cultural issues, and culture refers to a certain set of beliefs, ideas, expectations, stereotypes. You can't really pinpoint culture, but there's no denying that it's there. And it was, the politicization of a lot of these cultural issues that made Reagan's election possible. And so throughout the 1980s, you begin to see much more of a kind of this, fusion here, right? Combination of politics and culture. So in terms of creating conservative culture or translating conservative culture into law or politics, various organizations were set up. The Heritage Foundation was a conservative. Sometimes we call these think tanks. It's more or less a group of intellectuals who try to influence government policy. So the Heritage Foundation was a conservative, quote unquote, think tank who sought to create conservative laws, right? Or at least government policies. That's what their idea was. In terms of this group, again, we can call them conservative Christians. What they promoted was family values. Family values, of course, is very sort of subjective, but specifically to the religious right, this was an organization. Actually, no, moral majority organization. Really that promoted what we might call conservative Christianity. And the religious right, this is really a useful term to describe this group of people in the United States, but really how they were able to mobilize politically. So maybe, the political wing of conservative Christians. And, in the United States, there had always been a large constituency of those who would consider themselves to be conservative Christians or evangelical Christians. The difference in the 1970s, and especially in the 1980s, is that group becomes much more involved in politics. They are, at least from the 1980s, all the way up until maybe today, which is 2020, but certainly true in the 2000s and the 2010s, the most powerful voting bloc in the country. And the issues in which they are receptive to are issues, termed family values, or issues related to, again, what we might call the culture wars. Pat Robin, he was a famous, we'll call him I think, tevangelist, right? So he was a preacher or whatever his official title was, but he would have a very popular television show, and millions of Americans tuned in to people like Pat Robertson, the leader of the moral majority. His name was Jerry Falwell. These guys had huge audiences across the United States in which they talked about, these sort of particular issues, but then translated those issues into voting. And that's what really is significant about the religious right in the 1980s and onwards. Ronald Reagan himself, although this is very much couched in ideology, Reagan himself was not as much of an ideologue. So an ideologue is someone who subscribes or really kind of sticks by their ideological beliefs. You can think of ideology as being ideas. Reagan himself, even though he courted this conservative Christian vote, was not an ideologue. He was more of what we might call a practical. He favored certain conservative Christian ideas when they benefited his political career, but when they didn't, he came out against them. And an example was Reagan's stance on something like the Equal Rights Amendment or the women's rights movement, where early on in his career, he was much more receptive to those ideas. And later on, when courting this conservative Christian vote, he spoke out more against it. A good example of this, so, what do we mean by kind of culture translating into politics? The Parents Music Resource Center, or PMCR. This was an organization that wanted, and successfully did so, to label music. So certain music which was considered to be immoral, certain music that was considered to have eroded. This is kind of a term that a lot on the religious right used, was that American culture had been eroded by these immoral forces. So the desire by the Parents Music Resource Center was to label music explicit if it had any profanity in it, for example, or depictions of pornographic situations or sexual situations, to make sure that children are not listening to explicit material. And that was where you see this, CDs. If anybody out there even knows what a CD is anymore, it would have a label on the CD saying explicit lyrics, don't let your children buy it. So that was one example of how, you got culture translated into the political arena. Now, some of this also, this sort of cultural conservatism is happening against, or I should say, is happening in the background against what we call the AIDS crisis. And that was the introduction of HIV/AIDS to the United States. It is I believe it's a virus which lowers immunity, making those susceptible to other, other sort of, maybe diseases or viruses or any other illness that one could possibly take. And when HIV/AIDS arrived in the United States in, I believe, the 1970s, there was not really a lot that was known about it. You could say that it was an AIDS crisis. You could also say early on maybe it was an AIDS hysteria. It was an AIDS panic. And not a lot of people knew how it was, how it passed from person to person, but it's passed from person to person through sexual contact, or any sort of, blood to blood sort of transmission. So this was especially the case for blood transfusions. So if somebody was taken to a hospital and they needed blood from a blood donor, if that blood was infected with HIV/AIDS, it could spread to the person receiving that blood transfusion. And when it initially hit the United States, it was especially prevalent among the gay communities, especially in San Francisco and in New York. And so at the time, early on, it was called gay-related immune deficiency, and it was believed early on that it was only homosexual men that were susceptible to this virus, when in fact that turned out not to be the case. And part of the hysteria with this disease, fueled what we might call some homophobic remarks, remarks, or, at least attitudes. You had members of the conservative right, or the religious right, saying that the arrival of HIV/AIDS was there to punish homosexuals in the United States. And it kind of played against the backdrop of that conservative Christian movement. However, though, the hysteria and panic surrounding HIV/AIDS was, I would say, at least looking back on it, a lot that people could learn from the hysteria and panic that that, really gripped the nation. But also at the same time, you saw a lot of people step up and answer the challenge. So, for example, there was a lot of awareness raising about exactly how this virus was transmitted and how to protect oneself from this. One of the popular maybe movements to raise awareness about HIV/AIDS was silence equals death. That is to be open and talk about this virus and to make sure that others don't suffer the consequences from it. You also had giant concerts, the Live Aid concert to raise funds for research and to take care of those. And, since the arrival of HIV/AIDS, where early on in the 1980s, it was practically a death sentence, there's been a lot of medical breakthroughs and medical kind of funding going towards improving the lives of individuals, not only to stopping the spread of it, but improving the lives and the lifespan of individuals who contract it, to where today there's a lot more medical knowledge and medication for it that could potentially save people's lives, much more so than when it first hit in the 1980s. Lastly, another cultural trend, or maybe culture and how it translates into politics that we'll talk about, is the war on drugs and the road to mass incarceration. Mass incarceration refers to, we might call it the percent of Americans in prison. This graphic is a perfect example to show what mass incarceration is. You can see really from the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was elected, that the number of Americans in prison, really sort of skyrockets, much more than compared to eras in the past. And some of this is connected to what is sometimes referred to as the war on drugs. So violent crime throughout the 1980s, and especially through the 1970s, was on the rise, right? So crime, especially in cities, but that the reason for that was not well understood at the time. What many politicians and others believe, social commentators, was that the rise in crime and therefore the rise in incarceration was due to drugs. And so politicians declared a war on drugs, beginning with Richard Nixon, going really up all the way to, maybe the 2000s/2010s, where you started to have, at least anyways, for example, like the decriminalization of marijuana happen at a state level. But all throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and even into the 2000s, there was a very sort of confrontational talk about how drugs needed to be solved, and the link was made between drugs and this increase in violent crime. And therefore, if you could only get rid of the drugs, then therefore you could get rid of all the violent crime that was occurring in the U.S. Specific drugs were targeted more so than others, crack cocaine in particular. This was a drug more prevalent in urban, what we might call poor areas. And the the sentencing and the punishment for possessing crack cocaine, as opposed to other drugs, was much stricter and it was much longer. And so one of the effects of specifically targeting a drug like crack cocaine, or what was called the crack epidemic, was that those who were put in prison were disproportionately from urban areas, disproportionately from areas that were poor, disproportionately tended to be minority populations, African Americans, etc., etc. And that was the beginning of this mass incarceration movement. Nancy Reagan, the First Lady, even sought to tackle this issue. Typically, at least in the modern era, typically a First Lady has some type of social agenda, you might say. For Nancy Reagan, it was the Just Say No campaign. This is, of course, Just Say No to Drugs. Some of you may or may not be familiar, but programs like DARE, Drug Abuse Resistance Education, were made during the 1980s and into the 1990s to try and discourage drug use. And even on a state level, you began seeing much stricter laws. So two examples are mandatory minimums. Of course, that sounds pretty much what the term describes. It's that judges have no discretion when making sentences, especially for drug-related crimes. So this was, to have, again, a mandatory minimum drug sentence, right? And the 3 strikes rule, which was in California, and that was if someone commits 3, I believe it's felonies, they get life in prison. And so you had, or you could have a situation where potentially someone commits 3 felonies, nonviolent drug-related crimes, and they would receive life in prison, and that's only sort of contributed to the increase in the prison population.